We cannot be complacent about freedom in this country. That's the pitch I'm going to put out there for this video. We cannot be complacent about freedom in this country. Now, I've always rejected what I feel are flawed analogies with totalitarian states. I've heard people say we're just like North Korea, we're just like Putin's Russia, we're just like communist China. I do reject those. I still reject those analogies because I think they're flawed. I think they're based on ignorance about what the actual situation is. And having lived and worked in China, I can tell you Britain is not China. It's not. Um, Nevertheless, we cannot be complacent. We cannot assume that because we, as a nation state, deeply value freedom of expression and other such enlightenment values, that those things cannot be eroded. I do think in recent years there has been a gradual erosion. Now, I have supported some legislation which I feel is necessary. For example, some of the recent legislation against protests I support because it is tackling a particular kind of protest that hurts the public. This is something that favours the public. You cannot have a situation where the likes of Just Stop Oil or other zealots think that they can hold the public hostage. You cannot have a situation where criminal actions like vandalism or highway obstruction is deemed to be legitimate protest, because then you have anarchy. One of the hallmarks of democracy is rule of law. So democracy is not and never has been about we could do whatever we want. I think some libertarians are guilty of taking that view. They'll reject this, but I do think that they are sometimes go down the line of, well, we could basically do whatever we want, as long as it doesn't hurt others. But the thing is, where does that, who gets to determine that? Because Just Stop Oil will say, well, they're peaceful, yet their actions directly are hurting others by messing with people's lives. So there is some legislation I will support if it's based on common sense. But all legislation has to be looked at very closely and scrutinised, and we can never be complacent, because when legislation's passed, it becomes very hard to overturn. Now, Labour is almost certainly going to win the election unless they have some massive internal scandal. I think they're on course to win. One of my big concerns about Labour, particularly under Keir Starmer, is will they bring in ever more legislation dressed up as protecting minorities, for example? I mean, hate crime legislation that was brought in by the Blair government already raises a lot of questions over how exactly it is worded. Um, we have to have freedom to say controversial things. We have to have freedom to be able to criticize ideologies. Now, the Lee Anderson story, it's picked up pace. There's a lot more videos on it. This has become, some are describing it as a crisis. Um, there's a lot of things to say about that. I'm very, very troubled by it, because Lee Anderson clearly was talking about Islamists. What he said was he believed that the country wasn't run by Islamists, but Sadiq Khan and Keir Starmer are. Now, at worst, I think that could be slanderous towards rival politicians. They can say that's not true and that's slanderous, and they can personally take legal action against him if they feel that is the case. But he was suspended. Now, I think this was a cowardly move by the Sunak administration to appease left wing critics, basically, um, because the Tories are well aware that they've been attacking Labour over anti Semitism. So Labour will be quick on the bat to say, oh, well, look, the Tories are Islamophobic. Well, let's look at both of those things. If someone is coming out with anti Semitic tropes such as Jewish media control, that is specifically aimed at the Jewish people, right? If someone's talking about Islamism, as Lee Anderson was, that is aimed at an ideology. Anderson wasn't talking about Muslims. I think if an elected Tory MP was to attack all Muslims, I wouldn't have much sympathy with them. I'd say, well, that's not diplomatic, You're attacking a big segment of the population who are, many of them are patriotic. But to say that an ideology is somehow above reproach. I find that sinister. What I find particularly abhorrent is conflating it with racism. And there's people lining up across the media board, Karl Vorderman and Sankita Maiska, others. They're already pitching this as about Islamophobia, not about free speech. Um, and there's Tories that are throwing Mr. Anderson under the bus. Senior Tories like Oliver Dowden are lining up to say, "Oh, what he said was wrong, and we're sending out this message that we're going to punish him." I find it deeply disturbing. Now, I'm aware the Reform Party will be looking at this closely, and they may well get Anderson as a defector. Um, I think a party like the Reform Party will pick up a lot of disaffected Tories who feel that on issues like this, their party is selling out. Um, but it is very, very important that people understand there is a difference between criticizing an ideology and bigotry towards a people. Now, on the anti Semitism thing, I would be totally against a Labour councillor, for example, being punished solely for criticizing Israel. I think that's legitimate. Um, I even think it's legitimate to criticize Zionism because it's an ideology. Now, where's the red line? The red line will be if you start getting into anti Semitic tropes about Jewish control. But I would even say it's legitimate to criticize Zionism as a belief in a Jewish homeland, although I think that's more specifically an Islamist ideology, which is it's got a more um, pan scheme in terms of it's more international in its outlook. Zionism is more based on a belief in the state of Israel. But there must be freedom to dissent. There must be. I'm all for tackling bigotry in politics, but we cannot be complacent about freedom so long as this is happening. Because when you look at what's actually happened in this case, is Lee Anderson has been punished for calling out an ideology. That's what it amounts to. No rational person can see racism in what he said, unless they're thinking, oh, well, he's criticising the Asian mayor of London, therefore it's racist. But he criticised Starmer as well. So I find it very troubling, and I think it sets a very unhealthy precedent. Bear in mind, Islamism is an ideology that has directly killed and wounded hundreds of Londoners in recent years. So this isn't hot air. This is a real thing. Um, Now to say that it controls Starmer and Khan is quite a sweeping statement. Maybe he shouldn't have said that, but I do not see anything racist in what he said, and I find it deeply troubling that not for the first time racism is being weaponized. In Russia you can't criticize Putin. In China you can't criticize the Chinese Communist Party, but in Britain the taboo thing is anything to do with race, then you're immediately crucified if you're deemed to be engaging in racism, even if you're not. It's very, very troubling how this is weaponized. I think Islamophobia is weaponized to silence legitimate criticism of Islamic fundamentalism. But everyone with a conscience has to defend Lee Anderson, even if you don't agree with his specific claim. I'm not saying you have to like Lee Anderson. I am not a Tory voter. I'm sure I would disagree with him in other areas. But fundamentally, there has to be freedom to criticise ideologies. I notice Anderson himself has sort of been diplomatic in his response. He said he understood the government had no choice and he would continue to support their efforts against anti Semitism and Islamophobia. I think he should be a bit more robust in defending himself and pointing out, actually, I didn't say anything racist. But I suspect he's trying to spare Sunak's, it's a PR thing. He's trying to spare his party's embarrassment, so he's kind of being offering himself up in a sense. Perhaps he's trying to get his job back. I don't know. But the implications of this are very troubling. We need to very, very carefully scrutinize any legislation that comes in, ostensibly to protect people, but could actually be deemed to be an attack on freedom of speech. Now, hate speech, when you're riling against a minority group, is a different thing, but I honestly think we cannot be complacent about freedom in this country. And everyone with a conscience has to speak out.